Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Lee Harris. I'm a game design teacher at AIE Sydney's campus, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about storytelling in games. Specifically, I wanted to talk about narrative design. Narrative design is a little bit different than what you might expect, and there's a reason I'm using that term and not writer or storyteller, and it's this. There is game designers, who are the people who come up with the central mechanics of a game and who balance those to try and get the best possible experience for the end player. And then there's a narrative designer, which is someone who uses all kinds of those tools to try and tell a story, but they do it in a number of different ways. So what you might think of when you think about narrative is someone writing a script, and absolutely that is part of it. You will have people who write scripts on games, dialogue in cutscenes, those sorts of things, but there's a lot more to it than that. If you are a narrative designer, you're going to be working with those scripts and with the character models and with the health points that enemies have. All kinds of different things are at your disposal. So what I want to talk to you about today is what things you've got available to you which go beyond the scope of the script. So let's just sort of go through them one by one so you can get an idea for what a narrative designer might do. So first things first. Cutscene dialogue, possibly the most self-explanatory one. So everyone who's played a video game knows what a cutscene is. It's that moment where all of a sudden you're no longer in control and the characters start engaging in a cinematic moment, and it plays out like the scene from a movie. The example we've got here is from Kingdom Hearts. So somebody does write the script and somebody animates these models and gets the characters to tell the story. Usually these will come in at the end or beginning of a level to try and set the scene or to advance the plot in some way. But it's the in-between moments that I want to try and focus on today. So this is an example of a game called 50 Cent Blood on the Sand. And what this game did quite extensively was have the character sort of yell things out in the middle of action. So whilst you are running around, and this is common in a good number of games now, you'll have characters that are talking off the cuff. It didn't used to happen about 10 years or so ago. There's actually a very, very short history of games that want to do this sort of thing. So you can think of a lot of big name games that do it now. It's pretty uncommon to not have a game where the characters are constantly engaging in some kind of witty banter and repartee. So somebody not only writes these things, but has to figure out exactly when it's appropriate to say them. So after a line gets delivered and the voice acting has been recorded, you might be able to use that line in a number of different contexts, and as the narrative designer, it's going to be your task to figure out where and when that line is going to be best executed. It's not like a cutscene. You don't get to pick the exact dramatic moments, but you might have someone yell out, "They're surrounding us." You might have that line of dialogue in your pocket, and your task as the narrative designer is to go, right, when do I want them to yell that out? Now, you could only ever yell that out when there are enemies literally on every single side of the player, but that doesn't necessarily work. In most video games, you're rarely in a situation where you actually are completely surrounded, but for dramatic reasons, you might want to yell that out. You might want to have your characters say, "No, we're surrounded," because it really helps you convey the sense of drama and tension and stuff like that. So if you've ever played a game, and you've heard someone yell out something in the middle of battle, and it's been just slightly off, something hasn't been quite right about the dialogue, like if a character yelled out as though they were full of passionate hatred and anger at whoever the enemy was, yet the actual story of the game told you that they didn't really know who these people were or care about them that much, then that means a narrative designer hasn't done their job well. But if the narrative gets served properly by all these little bits of dialogue, then that's when it's coming together nicely, and that's when a narrative designer's done their job well. So, along a similar vein is conversational dialogue. This is a scene from Uncharted 4, which came out a little recently, and I've just been playing it, and it's wonderful. So it has a whole bunch of little conversations that Nathan Drake can engage in with various characters in between levels. I've listed these as conversational dialogue. They're not things that get, they don't get yelled out in the heat of passion. These are just little bits and pieces, like short snippets of conversation. You see, when we're talking about different mediums, like film, television, radio, video games, each one has different strengths. And one of the things that games don't have a lot of is dialogue, is stuff that gets imparted to the player. Typically, a player will experience 16 words per minute of gameplay, which is dramatically less than you're going to find in film, where there's a lot more. So we have to be really cautious with how often we use it. Almost every line of dialogue needs to serve some purpose in helping to build the world and set the scene. Next up is the narrator. So if anyone's ever played a game with a narrator, that's the sort of voice that is just describing what's going on. It's someone who knows everything and is describing in third person what's happening. So you'll see it in some big name games, but for the most part, it's actually something relatively underused. Narrators is used a lot in cinema. You'll have some voice just explaining exactly where they were and what was happening and what was going on at the time, but in games not so much. But when games do it right, it can be a very interesting tool. For instance, in the game Bastion, the narrator's voice changes based on whatever the player is currently doing. So if the player falls off the side, it's a platforming game, if the player falls off the side to their doom, the narrator will pipe in and just say, "It would appear the boy missteps at some occasions," and then it'll respawn you and then go, "But he wasn't done yet." The narrative actually hinged on the idea that whatever happened in the game was actually part of the story by weaving it in through the narrator's voice. Another excellent example of the narrator's voice being used well is in the Stanley Parable, where the narrator instructs the player to do something, and it very clearly gives them two choices that are totally different. The player walks into a room, on the left a red door, on the right a blue door, and the narrator says, "They went through the red door, and both doors are open." Now any player, most players in fact, love to push boundaries and see where the rules of a game lie. So a lot of them kind of like, well, hold on, you're telling me I can do this, but what happens if I go through the blue door? And if you do, the narrator pipes up again and says, "It would appear Stanley was not very good at following orders." So there's a lot of room with a narrator's voice to try and expand in video games. There's a lot of untapped potential. It's not used very often, but it's a very powerful tool. So that's another thing to consider beyond the simple cutscenes. We are still talking a lot about script though. So here's something a little bit more off the beaten track. Virtual books. If anyone's played one of the Elder Scrolls games, or for that matter a lot of role-playing games, you'd be aware of the trope of exploring the video game world, coming across a library or a book in a player's house, and just picking it up, and it actually shows you some of the text in the book, and you can actually read some of the history or the lore of the game world. It's a remarkable way of showing just how much work and time and effort has gone into creating a believable and three-dimensional world. Now, there are some obvious drawbacks to this. While it's a very useful way of putting a lot of information in, you've got to assume that most of your players are not going to be reading these books. They're not going to sit there and thumb through pages and pages and pages of text. I mean, if they were going to do that, they would actually read a book in real life. But surprisingly, even knowing that this stuff is there is a powerful signifier to the player of the depth and complexity of the game world. So if you're trying to tell someone that they are a part of a large legacy with a huge history behind it, then books might be a good way of doing it. Typically though, entire books is only for a very certain type of game. But the idea of picking up something which is perhaps a small fragment of a book is a very common thing. This is used to great effect in horror games to try and build suspense. If anyone's played the Resident Evil games, for instance, you'll often find yourself picking up a fragment or a scrap of a diary, and that diary is going to tell you just the last little bit of someone's journey where they're like, "I think the creatures are coming for me. I'm terrified. I don't know what's going on." And that's the last entry, and then you find their body in the next room or something really chilling like that. So not just massive books, but also small diary fragments are used to great effect. And let's get even smaller for a second, and let's talk about scraps and collectibles. So by scraps and collectibles, I mean, again, things like diary fragments, but even just going into odd objects that you find around the place. This is a very recent phenomenon. I mean, there have been games that have done it for many years, but recently it's really come into vogue. If anyone's played a game called Gone Home, which came out only a few years ago, it has a first-person perspective, and it has a simple mechanic where you can walk around and look around a home in the first person, and you can pick up objects and take a look at them. And some of those objects are diary fragments, some are audio recordings, some is an overdue bill that lets you know something about the family's financial situation, or one might be a Riot Girl sort of like black and white paper zine that's been printed out on like a photocopier to give you an idea of the sort of, punk and rebellious nature of the teenagers that live in the house. So there's a lot of power to be had in scraps and collectibles. Not only, as a narrative designer, not only coming up with what those might be, but figuring out where to leave them makes a whole world of difference. Knowing exactly what it's going to mean to put a scrap or a collectible in one room versus another is going to be your job as a narrative designer. So let's get a little more esoteric. Still, everything we've been discussing up until this point has been with words. It's been something that's written down, something that's read, something that's spoken. But what about character animations? The example I would give here is something like in Red Dead Redemption, where you've got all of the archetypes of the Old West. You've got the gunslinger, the sort of silent anti-hero protagonist type. You've got the local marshal in town who's doing the best he can with what he has in spite of wild ravages coming from left, right, and center. So one of the examples that I love from Red Dead Redemption is just a simple gesture where the sheriff is just bidding good day to the main character after the two of them have just completed a task together. So he says farewell and reaches up just with one finger and tips his hat, which is something you don't generally see a whole lot of these days, but it's perfectly appropriate for that time and that place, being, the Old West. It was just a simple sort of tipping the brim of your hat to someone to say hello, farewell, or even thank you. But a simple animation like that is a really powerful device for storytelling. So if you're working as a narrative designer, you'll want to be able to communicate with the modelers and the animators and the people who are doing all of your artistic work and say the character needs to be able to do these things, needs to be able to have these gestures. Along a similar line, body language. The body language of the character is something you can tell instantly. When Watch Dogs was first announced, I think it was at E3 in 2011 or 2012, one of the first images that people saw was of Aiden Pierce, the protagonist, walking down the street. There were two things that Aiden was doing that were quite interesting. The first is that his shoulders were hunched and his head was bowed. Full-brimmed cap on, he was looking down, he didn't want anyone's attention, he didn't want anyone to recognize him. Secondly, hands were in pockets. He looked kind of shady. He sort of looked like he wanted to not be identified, and you could tell that from his posture and from the way he walked. He was very seldom making eye contact with anyone around him, which is in stark contrast to the usual animation of any character when they're walking around, which has them typically looking around at eye level and engaging with whatever is directly in front of them. But this guy, he was supposed to be a hacker. He was supposed to be an underground, secretive rebel who was fighting against a hidden, authoritative kind of government. He wanted very much to remain hidden. So why would he be making eye contact? Somebody in the team had to come up with the idea that his body language needed to reinforce his status as someone who's very underground and very hidden. Along similar lines, we have costumes. If you look at a character and you can tell what sort of character they are straight away just from what they're wearing, then that's an easy shortcut to telling the player a whole lot of information. So I would use the example of the Joker from the Arkham series, the more recent set of Batman games from Rocksteady. You take one look at the Joker and you know that this is an ostentatious and a larger-than-life type of villain. You've got, of course, the elongated chin and the somewhat maniacal glare and those sorts of things, but also the really bright purple suit, like a really fancy suit, or at least it would have been back when it was first bought, but you can see tears and rips and things in it. He's wearing a big flower, which, it's sort of in keeping with the clown motif, except the flower is wilted and died. Those kinds of things speak really clearly to the heart of what's at the Joker's character. He is the fallen from grace clown. Next up, think about game worlds for a little bit. Think about billboards, think about posters. Think about how much you can tell from a world just from taking a look at some of the things that are written as advertisements. If you've got an advertisement for prosthetic limbs that are 10 times more powerful than actual arms kind of thing, you're definitely going to get a whole lot out of seeing something like that. It tells you a lot about the sort of sci-fi setting of the world. It tells you that maybe there's a lot of stuff between figuring out the difference between human and machine and where those lines get drawn. You can instantly get a lot about a game world. For anyone who's played BioShock Infinite, that was a game set in a fictitious city among the clouds called Columbia, which had an open rebellion from a group called the Vox Populi, who were trying to overthrow the powers, the leaders of the city. So there were huge flags and banners and posters all over the place that used very sort of harsh, almost graffiti-esque kind of fonts, and just showed people fists in the air. The text would say, "The Vox Populi reclaim this place." All of these little cues were buried throughout the game, so that the first time you encountered a member of the Vox Populi, you already knew all kinds of stuff about what that group represented, and therefore what that character was likely to be. Next up, architecture. It seems esoteric, and again, this is something where, as a narrative designer, you would want to work very closely with artists, and you wouldn't be the one who was actually physically constructing the buildings per se, but you would be the one that would have to go, okay, this game world is supposed to be very modern, very sleek, so we're going to be wanting to use lots of building materials that you wouldn't have found decades and decades ago. We want to go heavy on things like glass and steel, and maybe even some kind of plastic, and a lot less into things like wood and sandstone and those kinds of things. A great example of this would be something like, say, the Fallout series, or my personal favorite, Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, which have decrepit environments that are falling apart from ruin. They've been largely reclaimed. In the case of Fallout, it's all rubble in a post-apocalyptic environment. In the case of Enslaved, it's nature having regrown and taken over everything again, so you've got trees that are now growing through houses and that sort of thing. If you take a look at something like that, as a player, you know instantly that there is a lot going on in this world. You can tell so much about the history of it. And this is one of they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, it's entirely true. If you were to say to someone, this world has been ravaged by some kind of horrible disease and all of humanity got wiped out, and now it's set hundreds of years later, and so there's lots more wildlife and growth and greenery and stuff like that growing inside the cities. That's all well and good, but it took me, 10 seconds to tell you that? If you could say it in a single image, people can register all of that information in a fraction of a second. Much more efficient and better for storytelling. Next up, if anyone's played a game where there's dialogue trees, so that's where you get a little bit of dialogue, and then you get to pick what your character says next. One thing I want to bring up here is that you can tell a lot about a character based on not just what the specific line is the player chooses, but also what the other options are. If the player plays as a character and knows that they can choose a positive or a negative or a medium response, they can see what kind of negative character their character could be if they'd have chosen that option. They don't have to choose it to know that it was there. So the point is, your player will be registering all kinds of things about what the player can be. Next up, damage and health. Now, if we were to try and describe that a player character was nowhere near as powerful as an enemy, let's say we were painting like a David and Goliath picture. The example I would use for this one would be the very beginning of Infamous 2. If we simply make the other character look much more powerful, make them huge and make them red in the eyes and have them have huge attacks that cast fireballs, and you're just a humble individual person, that's going to give us a pretty good example. But further than that, if we want to actually define how much damage an enemy takes, how powerful a player's attacks are, we can give them the power relation in a way no other medium can. It's difficult to describe what the power relationship is between someone who's of a certain status and another in a book. It's a little bit easier in a film because you can use a lot of visual imagery to indicate types of power. But in a video game, we can just say, right, you can do exactly this much damage to this enemy, and this enemy can resist exactly this much before this enemy succumbs. That's a really great way of telling people things about characters. You can also use a lot of other techniques. I'll sort of finish up, but you can describe what kind of color palette gets used. You can talk to your art team about what kind of mood you intend to convey. Are you trying to make people feel happy, feel scared, feel threatened, feel intensely enthusiastic about something? The art style and the color palette and these kinds of things can help evoke that. The music of a game, used to marvelous effect in Shadow of the Colossus. Music helps you understand what you're supposed to be feeling. It was a storytelling device in cinema long before they actually recorded audio and had spoken dialogue. They would tell people what they were supposed to be feeling by having accompanied music that would play alongside the film. And games are no different. If you want people to feel epic and powerful, you can put a huge triumphant score next to something. So the narrative designer's task here would be to go, right, when should certain pieces of music play, at what point, and to what effect? What is the intention? What am I trying to do by playing this piece of music here? So you'd be working very closely with the musicians for that one. Sound effects are along a similar sort of line. You can have all kinds of sound effects that play that give you an idea of threats that are around the corner, or if you hear birds chirping, you might know that everything's okay and it's a sunny morning. It all sort of helps tie it together. So if it's starting to sound like I'm saying that pretty much everything to do with video games is part of narrative design, well, that's because it is. It absolutely is. So people who are trying to make game experiences come together will need to not think of their roles as being completely distant from one another. You want your musician to be working with your art team, to be working with your sound designers, with your game designers, and with everybody else to try and create the same type of player experience. So when you're a narrative designer, when you're working in that kind of field, what you really want to be doing is thinking about every aspect of the video game as a tool that helps reinforce the mood and helps deliver the player experience. That's where your head should be at as a narrative designer. And narrative design is only one aspect of the much larger field of game design. Game design is a very varied and difficult to pin down subject that requires you understanding how to manipulate a player to make them feel a certain way and to try and balance and adjust a game to deliver the experience that it's supposed to deliver. It's a very varied discipline. There's an awful lot to it, so there's a lot more than I can cover in just 20 minutes. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you for having me.